Hi, my name is Kendall Mayo. I am a instructor of Bible theology and humanities here at Sager Classical Academy in Siloam Springs, Arkansas. In the classical Christian education movement, there's an intense emphasis on the reading of great books. But what I found is that as a result, we actually have a bit of a blind spot when it comes to reading texts that we or our culture or our school's culture may not necessarily agree with. It may not, in their conclusions, align with our values. And as a result, there can be a tendency to actually avoid those texts, to instead of having our students engage with those texts, actually pull away from them. And I wanted to find a way to help our students actually engage with works such as these quote-unquote not so great books. So in this discussion, we're going to consider the work of Bernard of Clairvaux, specifically how some of his work I think is manifested in Dante's Divine Comedy, to give us an idea of how we might go about reading texts that we may not vibe with as much. So without further ado, let's jump into it. I'm going to start with this question. What is it that we eat? What is it that we eat? I'll explain what I mean. In the classical education world, you will hear regular conversation around the idea of virtue formation. At my school, the school that I teach at, the mission statement actually has this phrase: the goal is, through the stuff that we teach, to actually nourish the soul. We are nourishing the soul. We're not teaching just to give students information, just the things to lock into their heads. We actually want them to be shaped, their virtues to be formed through the things that they are quote unquote eating, what they're consuming, the stuff that they're reading. And the diet in most classical education spaces is usually described as something like the great books, the great ideas. To the point that at my previous job, my position was called instructor of the great books. The great books are talked about everywhere. And the idea is that as students would read and truly interact with the meat of these books, that something about reading that is actually doing something to their soul. It is shaping them in virtue. And that ultimately is the dream of education, right? Well, I want to clarify something, because I don't actually think that when we say this, we mean it as straightforward as it can come across. Because we really only kind of mean that. One of my best friends, Nathan, is teaching 7th grade humanities right now, and they are working through the Odyssey. Now, his students, I have them for Bible, and they, around early last week, started coming to me talking about how excited they were for the chapter that they were about to read. Specifically, this was the chapter where Odysseus returns home, and it is time for him to clean house, to get rid of these suitors. And suddenly I have these 7th graders, they're all screaming how excited they are for the murder chapter. They're like, it's time. And in the story, Odysseus, they keep referring to him as Buff Grandpa. I'm not entirely sure why. But Buff Grandpa, Odysseus, he finds one of these guys who's a suitor for his wife, and Odysseus strips naked, beats the living snot out of this guy, and then finds all the other suitors and just tears them to shreds, just kills them like crazy. Well, this is kind of my question. We tell our students and we tell our families that we want our students to nourish their souls on the great books. But we don't mean just like willy-nilly. Like, we don't mean just like read this story and take whatever virtue it is that Homer is trying to teach you. Right? If we were to do that, we would create warmongering students who are all too ready to kill and deceive in order to achieve their ends from just reading the Odyssey, this book that we're giving 7th graders. Seemingly, when we say that we're wanting to cultivate virtue formation in these students by quote unquote feeding them these books, by nourishing their souls on these books, we mean something else. When we read these books, we're eating something else. The thing that we're feeding our soul on is not just this rampant violence. No, we're actually filtering something. Somehow, in reading the Odyssey, there's a long tradition that says in reading books like the Odyssey or the Iliad, reading books like Brave New World, reading books like the Scarlet Letter, and reading these books, there is something good happening to your soul, but it can't just be that we take whatever the author is trying to convey at face value. We're doing something else. What is it that we're actually eating in these stories? What is it that we are nourishing ourselves on? there is an ancient Christian idea of plundering the Egyptians. You'll recall in the book of Exodus, as the Israelites are about to escape from the kingdom of Egypt, God gives them favor with the Egyptians around them, and all of these tools, all of this gold, all of these resources that were at one time used towards the oppression of the Israelites, suddenly the Israelites are given them, and these tools of their oppression are now used for the Israelites for God's purposes, right? A way I like to describe this, but for early Christians, when they start doing missions work, they start baptizing the ideas of the cultures around them. You think of it this way, in the early church, if you're trying to minister to a Greek person, you are a Jewish convert to the faith, and you go up to a Greek person and you say, Jesus died for your sins. He was the Messiah. That Greek person doesn't have absolutely no clue what you're talking about, right? Number one, what's a Messiah? Number two, a guy died. So people die all the time. My sins, what do you mean? Were people like just not nice to their God? Did they forget to make a sacrifice? What are you talking about? Right, there's all of these ideas of the Jewish faith that are so deeply rooted in story, rooted in the story of God's dealings with the Israelites. And so what we find early Christians doing is, often from a missional impulse, taking the ideas from Greek thought and baptizing them. A great example of this you see is Paul when he goes on Mars Hill. He plunders the Egyptians. He looks out at the statue, this idol to the unknown God, and he goes, oh, you guys are worshiping a God you don't know? I know that God. Let's talk about him. Taking an idea from those specific people, baptizing it, and using it to the ends of spreading the gospel. We actually see the Apostle John do this exact thing in the opening verse of his gospel. John says in the beginning was the Word, the Logos. This idea of Logos was a Greek Stoic idea, and yet John seems fully comfortable taking that idea, baptizing it, and saying, hey, this is Jesus. He's not trying to then wholeheartedly agree with the entirety of Stoic philosophy, but he seems pretty comfortable taking an idea from the Stoics and molding it to match what it is that God has revealed of himself through Jesus, right? We're plundering the Egyptians. It's an ancient Christian tradition, taking ideas that don't necessarily align with Christian values, Christian ideas, Christian theology, and then shaping them so that they do. I want to ask, is this something that we can do with the Odyssey? Well, absolutely. In fact, Christians have been doing that for a long time. For sure, Odysseus is not an exemplary Christian, but he is courageous. What can we take from Odysseus about how courageous he is, about maybe even the idea of wit? I've heard lessons taught about how Jesus' command to be as innocent as doves, but as cunning as serpents. You can actually see some of that cunning as serpents in Odysseus. We're not telling our students to become warmongers, to become murderers, to kill anyone and anything to get with the girl that they love. But we can teach them something about Christian virtue, about what it means to persevere, about what it means to be brave. Those kinds of virtuous ideas that even the Christian would affirm. Here's really what I'm saying. Anytime we teach a text, there is an assumed methodology, specifically an assumed idea of how we are going to receive or take good from that text and align it to what we profess as Christians. Said otherwise, everybody has a filter. Whenever we read these texts, whenever we as Christians and educators read these texts, we are immediately filtering those things in our minds to show the kids what it is that is good. But here's the problem. We often don't know what kind of filter we have. And this can become an issue because what we can do is sometimes impose our own ideas of good and bad onto a text as we're reading it and teaching it, because we don't recognize that we have a filter. We may simply think that we're teaching what the text says, when in fact we're imposing some of our own ideas on here. I think even worse, what can end up happening is that we can assume that we only teach texts that teach good Christian values, when at the end of the day, the majority of the Western canon doesn't necessarily teach good Christian values, but we've still made use of them. So I think it's important for us to consider, what kind of filter do we have? What kind of filter do we as classical educators make use of in order to teach students true Christian virtue from pagan texts or even books outside of the Western canon? Well, that's where I think Bernard can become really helpful. I want to talk about Bernard of Clairvaux and how understanding his idea of Christian formation can actually give us a good model for building our filter, talking about how it is that we teach our students these texts. I want to clarify, this is not, I think, the only way to teach these texts, but I think it is a good one. In true Anglican fashion, it is a good way to follow Jesus in the kind of cultural moment that we are. So let's do a quick summary of Bernard's thought, and then we'll work on applying it to reading a text. So quick overview, St. Bernard was a abbot in France in the 12th century. I was looking for icons for France, and this man with the mustache was as close as I could find. So I hope it's good enough. He was an abbot. He was leading these monasteries. He was famous for his preaching, for his ideas on Christian formation. Most importantly, it was this idea that sort of rooted in the Augustinian tradition that the love of the triune God is superior to all things. And everything that we do, any attempts at knowledge, any attempts at wisdom, all of these things are ultimately pointing us toward the love of the triune God. To clarify, this idea of love is not one that says just love of anything, but also kind of in an Augustinian fashion, it is ordered loves, properly ordered loves, as they ought to be directed toward the God of love. So, an unordered love of cookies is not greater than all things, though it is greater than most things. But rather, love as it is directed toward God and as it is received by us from God is greater than all things that we do. It's a really beautiful, not just a sentiment, but a beautiful theological principle. And at the same time, Bernard was a pretty avid proponent for the Crusades. Studying Bernard is a really interesting endeavor, because he's a man who truly contains multitudes, can simultaneously say that love is greater than all things, and I'll kill who I need to kill to get the land I need to have. He's a complicated figure, and it makes him a lot of fun to read. So that's a little bit of his background. There's a ton more here to explore, but I just want to give you just a little bit as we get ready to talk about his model for Christian formation. So for Bernard, the ultimate goal of the human life is to see God. He's going to take this from John's first epistle, chapter 3, right? In seeing God, we actually become more like God. In seeing God, we are actually seeing the source of all truth and beauty itself. So in contemplation, in the Christian seeking to see God as he is, they're actually pursuing the end of all science, of all literature, of all art. They're seeing the source of all that is good and true and beautiful in the world. So to see God is the ultimate form of education in some sense. That language that theology is the queen of the sciences. You can imagine Bernard altering that to say theophany is queen of the sciences. Seeing who God is ultimately is what the human life, every aspect of the human life, is directed towards. And this process of attaining to this spot of seeing God for Bernard happens in 3 stages. And what I find really interesting, I would argue that these 3 stages actually serve as Dante's muse for the Divine Comedy. Whenever Dante writes the Divine Comedy, right, like in Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, I actually think as high of an opinion as Dante has of Bernard, as you see toward the end of the Divine Comedy, it seems like that Bernard's theology of how spiritual formation takes place actually lines up really well with how Dante views this world of his comedy. I want to show you a little bit of what I mean here. These are some pictures representing the 3 stages of Dante's comedy. On the furthest left, you see hell. It is this deep descent into the bowels of the earth with Satan frozen in ice in the middle. As you descend down, you find that each layer of hell is organized by loves, the things that you love. And the further you go down, the worse your love is. So, for example, early on, you meet the gluttons. Well, the gluttons love a good thing, right? They love food. They just love it improperly. But by the time you get to the bottom, you meet who Dante views as the worst of all the sinners, who are the betrayers. Why are people who are treacherous, why are they at the bottom of hell? Well, because for Dante, treachery is one of the only sins that lacks love altogether. It is actually the full rejection of love. It's recognition that you had a relationship and then throwing that away. So at the center of hell, you see Dante, or not Dante, whoa. At the center of hell, you see Satan, and he's got 3 heads, and he is just gnawing on Judas, on Brutus, and on Cassius, 3 of the greatest traitors in history. Hell is organized by our loves, but so is purgatory. This middle picture is a depiction of Mount Purgatory. Each of the cornices or the circles going up the mountain represent different vices, and they correspond pretty closely to the loves going down in hell. But the difference is, in each of these cornices, the people are sloughing off those sins. One of my favorite scenes is up toward the top. We see Dante going through the cornice of lust. Lust is the very last vice for Dante to get through, and it's so high up because lust is just almost a virtue. It's just almost people loving each other, but it's distorted, right? So as Dante ascends this mountain, we see him sloughing off his sin, and as he looks on at the examples of those who are getting rid of their sin also. As far as Dante is concerned, I actually think both hell and purgatory are not so much depictions of life after our death, but actually of life as a Christian now. Purgatory especially seems to be what it means to be a Christian after you're baptized, getting rid of your sin. And then this third picture, this one furthest to the right, is a depiction of paradise. Dante descends into hell, he climbs up the mountain, but then when he gets to the top of Mount Purgatory, where the Garden of Eden is, he sits there and has a number of visions, but is basically led into the contemplative life. He's led into prayer, into acts of service. And in doing so, God actually grabs him and launches him into the sky. He goes on, I tell my students, is a virtue rocket, a space adventure through the cosmos, going to each of the different planets. And each of these planets correspond with another virtue. That's just kind of the basic idea of the direction that Dante's Divine Comedy goes. And I promise I'm not just saying this for nothing. I actually think that this can help us understand Bernard of Clairvaux's theology of formation. And I want to show you what I mean here. So remember, I said that Bernard's idea of formation happens in 3 steps. And the first is humility. The person who wishes to follow Jesus must first be humbled by Jesus. So number 1, they must acknowledge their sins. To borrow language from the letter to the Ephesians, they must unmask their sin, see what their sin actually is, right? This is a work that for Bernard is actually done by the Son. And I find this fascinating. He describes the Son as being a severe master. And it seems interesting because for us, so often the Son is kind of seen as like the nice one. I know for a number of my students, the Father is seen as kind of the angry one. The Spirit is kind of just the force. And then the Son is like the nice older brother who keeps Dad from getting mad at us, right? So it's interesting, whenever we read Bernard describes the Son as revealed to be a harsh master. But it's important as to why Bernard thinks that. This language of unmasking is really important. And I'll reference the Divine Comedy here, I think, to help. Dante, when he's going into hell, he gets to the circle of the gluttons. Now, these gluttons, these are people who in their life, they saw food as this like ultimate enjoyment. They'll do anything in order to eat enough to get fat, to do whatever they want to do. But in hell, they now lay in piles of garbage, of just rotting food, as Cerberus, the 3-headed dog, like walks around them. In the circle of gluttony is unmasked. We see what it truly is. Though it appears to be this feasting and this happiness, this joy all the time, it's revealed to truly just be rotting flesh. It is not as good as it seems to be. And what I find so fascinating is that for Bernard, the process of us acknowledging our own sin, it has to be done by Jesus. One, because Jesus is the model of humility, right? But I like it more, especially when we think about this language of the harsh master. You see, humility or humiliation for Bernard is not this like self-deprivation of, oh, I'm the worst, oh, I'm terrible and disgusting, blah, blah, blah. No, we must acknowledge our sin and what it is, what it truly is, and how heinous it is. But that is only done ever through the eyes of the lover of our souls. It's only done by the Son who, though he is harsh, though he does truly point out what your sin is, he is still the one who died for you and loves you immeasurably. So it can never be self-deprecation. It is actually an act of love by the Son that he shows you what the cancer actually looks like. And this is, I find fascinating also, for Bernard, it's very important that the Son leads us in this humiliation. The Son does not carry us in humility. Humility requires effort on our end. It is work. It is striving. But as we do it, the Son leads us in where we are to go, in literally the way of the cross, following in his footsteps up to Golgotha. He leads us because he's done it before and he knows where to go. So I want to show you actually how I think this shows up in Dante's Inferno. Here's Dante, our little pink guy up here. In the first part of our book in the Inferno, Dante begins coming out of this wood. He sees the sun. He longs to climb this mountain to go to where God is, but he's unable to. Rather, Virgil, reason itself, actually has to take him on a journey of humility. Before Dante can ascend, he, like his Savior, must first descend into the lower parts of the earth. Dante must trek through hell by his effort, being led in order to see what sin really is, that it can be uncovered and unmasked for what it truly is. Not gilded, as it is so often presented, but truly heinous and corrupt. So let's go on to step 2. So the second part of Bernard's model is compassion. So in the first part, we have seen my sin. I have looked intently at my sin. And seemingly for Bernard, this is what leads us to baptism. We see our sin and then we are baptized. We're brought to faith because we have no other hope. So now we've seen our sin, but now we must learn to love the other sinners. The idea is something like, if you truly have acknowledged your sin, if you've truly seen and recognized how difficult it is to get rid of your sin and what it has done to you, you will, even when you see your enemy, you will only be able to love him because you recognize in him the same pain, the same disease that you have. After you've been humbled, and only, for Bernard, only after you've been humbled, after you've seen your own sin, can you then learn to have compassion on those sinners that you see around you. This is, for Bernard, a work of the Spirit. Whereas the Son leads us in humility, the Spirit also leads us in compassion, this bond of love that unites the brethren, as we see in Ephesians. We are led in compassion, and again, importantly, only after we have seen our own sin. So I want to show you how this shows up in Dante, once again. So Dante has been led down here into the pit of hell. He has humbled himself. He has seen his sin for what it truly is. But afterwards, Dante must be led in compassion, in the correct ordering of his loves. He will then begin to ascend the mountain of purgatory, moving up through its various cornices, being inspired by the good works and the correctly ordered loves of those who are stuck on the mountain, who are not stuck on the mountain, but are also ascending the mountain. As Dante sees the love, the rightly ordered love of those on purgatory, his loves also begin to change. He begins to have compassion on those that he wouldn't have otherwise. Interestingly, in our lust cornice up at the very top, we see Dante actually learning to have compassion even on homosexuals, which would have been strange for the Middle Ages. But we see it's this really interesting scene where those who are struggling with lust are walking through this fire one direction, and Dante sees another group walking toward them. And for him, these are those of unnatural loves is the word that he uses. But nonetheless, we see Dante being led to compassion for those who followed Jesus and were still unable to slough off their sin of lust, whichever way that was ordered. Dante is being led in compassion for other sinners, even those who may have been considered more reprobate than others in that culture. Compassion is at the heart of what Dante is learning on his trip to purgatory, up purgatory, and I think that is ultimately due to the work of Saint Bernard. So now we have been led in humility by the Son. We have been led in compassion by the Spirit. And now we move on to the final and the most exciting part of what Bernard is showing us. Now that you've done those things, you're free. In a sense, borrowing from G.K. Chesterton, we have now been given space for good things to run wild. My old head of school, he borrowed this from someone, and I'm not sure from whom, but he talked about this idea of having a playground put up on a cliff. And the playground by itself, if it just sits there, nobody can have fun on the playground because they're all scared of falling off the cliff. But if you put up a fence, this kind of like boundary, suddenly you can go nuts on the playground. Go crazy. Yeah, absolutely. You've established the proper boundaries. The fence is there not so that you'll be scared of the cliff, but so that you can finally play. You can do what you want. We see this idea showing up in Bernard and also in Dante, that once your desires have been properly ordered, the call of the human is to truly do what you want. Because what you want with properly ordered loves is the same that God wants. It's true and absolute freedom in a way that a human hasn't known before. Bernard makes use of this language of rapture. When I say rapture here, I don't mean like premillennial, left behind style rapture of the whoosh, you're gone, and then there's some people left over that have to go through the tribulation. I mean some kind of ascension that happens in the here and now. He makes use of Paul's language from 1 Corinthians about this third heaven, this vision that Paul has where he's actually in himself on this earth, taken up to see God. For Bernard, this is the goal of the Christian life, is rapture. It is to be taken away to where God is. And importantly, whereas the Son led us in humility and the Spirit led us in compassion, the Father is the one who raptures us. And for Bernard, you are not led, you are carried. This is something that the human cannot do. We cannot get ourselves to where God is. Rather, we must contemplate, stay in contemplation, considering the goodness and the mercies and the beauty of God, waiting to be carried away. My spiritual director is a Franciscan man, and Father David, whenever he talks about prayer, he offers an image that I find really helpful here. Father David will say that prayer is a lot like being a dog in your master's house. He says, imagine there's like a den, like this reading area, and there's this big chair where your master always sits. And you're this dog waiting in the den. And whenever your master comes home, he sits in the chair, propped up by the fireplace. You, as the dog, immediately run over and lay down next to your master's chair. Sometimes your master will say something to you. A majority of the time he won't. But nonetheless, you lay by his chair just in case he says something. Because if he says something, you want to be there ready to respond. I think this is how Bernard describes the life of contemplation. Contemplation, chewing on the scriptures, spending time in prayer, time in song, time in silence. This space of contemplation is the space where, for Bernard, you are making yourself available to be raptured, to be taken away to where God is, to meet him, so that when he speaks, you are nearby to hear him. Now that you're free, truly living the free life of the Christian, as we seek to spend time with God, we can now be carried away by the Father, not under our own effort. Importantly, contemplation doesn't earn us a spot or get us closer to where God is. It simply puts us around where he comes often, so that when he speaks, we're there to hear him. I'm going to show you how I think this shows up for Dante. We saw humility and compassion now the climbing of purgatory. When Dante gets to the top of purgatory, he gets to earthly paradise, the Garden of Eden. And when he gets there, he has a vision of Rachel and Leah, and I can't remember which one corresponds to which, but one of them represents the contemplative monastic life, and one of them represents the active monastic life, like Franciscans going out and preaching, doing works, versus the contemplative life, being more cloistered and spending time in prayer and reading and that kind of stuff. Well, Dante goes up there, and he's basically encouraged to do what he wants, to enjoy this life where God has designed humans to be, however he sees fit, whether in contemplation or in the active life. He even sees a parade where the life of God is made more fully aware to him. And it's here on the mountain that something crazy happens to Dante. Beatrice, the embodiment of divine love, comes to Dante. And whereas Dante had to strive to climb down hell, he had to strive to climb up purgatory, Dante is whisked away and carried off into the heavens, into the spheres. Dante is showing us a model of what Bernard is describing. Whereas Dante can strive for humility and strive for compassion, to see God as purely gift. It is merely something that we can receive as it is offered to us. So that is our model for the Christian life, according to Bernard. And you may be asking, Kendall, you said this is going to be a lecture about pedagogy, how it is that we can teach. And that's actually what I want to cover now. I want to suggest that what we can get from Bernard here is pedagogical humility, a recognition of what it is that we as teachers are able to do and supposed to do, and what it is that we're not supposed to do, what we're not able to do. Let's go back to this picture here. I want to take, for example, teaching a text that may be considered scandalous in certain circles. So next year, I'm going to be teaching Era 3 in our Great Conversation class. Era 3 is the Reformation to the modern day. So an important text that we're going to have to cover is the Communist Manifesto. Now, the manifesto is a text that many members of our school family are going to have problems with. But I want to argue that Bernard actually offers us a model to read this text that some Christians may not like, and yet still get really beautiful truths from it. I use the Communist Manifesto as an example, but I use this mainly as kind of a flashpoint text that might upset some people. I really mean this for teaching anything. But this is kind of a call v'omer. If you can do it with this, certainly you can do it with other texts as well. So let's start with our first step, with humility. Bernard calls the Christian to humility. Well, if we're going to teach the Communist Manifesto, the first thing that I want to do is identify what kind of great idea are Marx and Engels trying to get at. They're not writing for nothing. They've got some idea that they want to convey. And as I read, the theme of justice becomes really apparent to me. Justice, a beautiful Christian concept of virtue. We want to consider what it is Marx and Engels have to say about justice. Well, step one is humility. So the first thing I would ask of students, let's take some time to reflect. I've been giving students 4 questions for this time. Whenever we begin to consider a passage, what it might be saying about some larger virtue, we ask 4 questions. First question, how have you experienced, in this case, justice? How have you experienced justice in the world? How have you experienced injustice in the world? Those are our first 2, and those ones are usually easy. Students have plenty of examples of how they've seen these kind of things happen in the world. But the more important questions come next. The third question, how have you acted justly in the world? And number 4, how have you acted unjustly? I really like to spend some time here, spend some careful time having students consider, how have I been unjust? What have I done that has not aligned with God's idea of justice? We want to take time to humble ourselves, to consider, hey, this is an ideal. Justice is difficult to attain, as noted by the entirety of human history, and as noted by my own life. I have acted unjustly. We want to start with humility, with self-reflection. The second thing we want to do is learn to love the character. Now, in this case, this is not a piece of fiction, right? The Communist Manifesto is a treatise written to address real-world problems. So there's not so much a character here, but I would say we'll start with Marx. After students have considered how they have been unjust, this is where I, as a teacher, want to give a lot of context to Marx. What was his life like? What kind of things was he seeing? What were the working conditions of the people that he saw? What would it have been like to be a worker, a factory worker in the 18th, 19th, 20th century? What would your life have looked like? Why might Marx have been so angry at the things that he saw? Here's what I want to suggest. If we're called to humility first, and then Bernard says that the Spirit leads us in compassion, remember what happens in that compassion step. Because we have seen our sin, it is now impossible to do anything except love the other sinner that we see, even if we find them flawed. When I say love, I don't mean even agree with, but I mean to recognize their pain, for they too seek to rid themselves of this sin that they have in them. Or even if they don't seek to get rid of it, they still have it. And we now can have compassion on them because we know what it's like to have it and not be able to get rid of it or even recognize it. In some sense, this second step of compassion sounds a lot like the words of God in Deuteronomy and through the prophets. You'll treat your servants well because you too were slaves in a foreign land. Treat the foreigner well because you too were exiles and sojourners. Right? You too were filled with injustice. And so now as we read Marx and he looks out at those around him, we learn to have compassion on Marx, even if us or our parents don't necessarily agree with him. We want to learn to love the character. In another example, we're reading, next year we're going to be reading Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, one of my favorite books. For a fiction example, this unnamed character, as we look at him go to this college and be kicked out of this college, so we see him join this speaking circuit and then be thrown under the bus in the speaking circuit and then kind of just living off the grid in the city. We see him doing some things that are not admirable, some kind of wicked things, and yet we're called to love him. So now after, for that book, oddly enough, justice is also kind of a big deal for Invisible Man. How is it after we have considered our own injustice and how we've acted unjustly, how can we learn to love this unnamed character in the book? This compassion is really, really important. And that brings us to step 3. Right now on this slide, my face is hiding what step 3 says, but it says contemplate truth. It's to contemplate truth. We, after reflecting, after learning to love the character, we are now invited to actually contemplate what is it that, in this case, Marx, let's weigh his truth claims. Let's consider if what he argues for points us more directly to the love of the triune God or further away from it. And I think this is really important, right? Remember how Bernard describes the third step. Both of the first 2 steps require striving on our parts. And I would argue in this pedagogical model on our parts as teachers, we must, with effort, cultivate a field for these students to learn in. We need to help them have space to reflect and to work through that reflection. We need to do good work on doing historical context or explaining the stories of whatever text we're reading, right? There's work to be done there. But ultimately, for the students to make connections about truth, it's actually kind of beyond our power. It's not something that we do by our own efforts. Sure, we point them in right directions. We can help them kind of stay away from errors, from just wrong factual information. But whether or not that clicks for them, whether or not that eureka moment happens and suddenly they understand something about justice, that's really God's work. It's not ours. I like the language of contemplation when it comes to weighing the truth claims of text, of what it is this author, fiction, nonfiction, may be trying to communicate to us, because it reveals how limited we as educators are. It shows us kind of the limits of where we are to go. Yes, we're helping them find truth, but ultimately truth is something that is found in contemplation, something the student is carried to. And I want to give a quick example to talk about that. There was a book, I'm forgetting the name of the author right now, but the title of the book is just called The Care of Souls. It's by Lexham Press. I can't believe I can remember that, but read it. It's Lexham Press's Care of Souls. The author, his name escapes me. But this author, he's writing for pastors, and he talks about how, for him, pastoral care is very similar to the work of a farmer. See, for a farmer, there absolutely is work involved, right? The farmer must spend a ton of time tilling the fields, putting out fertilizer, planting seeds well, maybe making sure there's water for the things they need as irrigation is working properly. And then it's a lot of waiting, right? The farmer is not actually involved in the growth process. The farmer is merely involved in the preparation process, caring for these seeds as the things are growing, making sure that they stay in alignment, trimming things as they need to be trimmed. But ultimately, the growth is God's. right? The farmer doesn't grow anything. I had a conversation with a parent the other day who was talking about they're nervous that their kid was starting to date. And they're just asking if I had any advice, which I thought was hilarious because I do not have children. I am only 2 years married. But I thought of this image, right? I had friends growing up who their parents were really not involved in their dating life. And as a result, they kind of went astray and kind of did their own thing, and that wasn't great. I had other friends who kind of locked their parents kind of locked them down, and they weren't allowed to date at all, talk to people. They were kind of shut in their house. And that also seemed to cause some problems. And what I said was, I don't really have an answer, but I know that whenever I see humans trying to get involved in the growing process, trying to force growth on the people around them, trying to get involved in God's work of growing the person, that's when I see errors. That's when I see problems start to happen in the development of that person. To teach these truths, to help students come to virtue, is like being a farmer, I think. It takes cultivation. It takes work on our end to foster a good environment for that virtue to be formed. But ultimately, that virtue formation is something between the student and God. It's humility, recognizing that we can't cause that growth. When we talk about how St. Augustine considers interpretation of the scriptures, I think we get kind of a helpful analogy to this, right? The study of the scriptures for Augustine, if you came to some kind of factual error in your study of the scriptures, but that factual error still led you to the knowledge of the love of the triune God, you've still read the passage correctly, right? Even if you got factual errors wrong, the fact that reading that incorrectly still led you to the love of God means that you did it, right? We're seeing ultimately growth is not our job. As teachers, growth is not our job. Our job is to foster good situations. It is to correct and to prune and to cultivate. Yes, absolutely. But I think Bernard's model allows us to see that when we are teaching, we are not cultivating virtue. God is. God is growing virtue. We are good stewards. We help till the fields, so to speak. But that last step of contemplation, it's not something we can lead students to. It is something we can simply take them to the edge of and then let God do the rest of it. It's kind of the pedagogical form of you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And that, my friends, is what I think Bernard of Clairvaux can teach us as we teach all kinds of things. Great books we may consider not so great, the scriptures themselves, as we are pointed toward the love of God, as we are led in humility by the Son, as we are led in compassion for the author or for the characters by the Spirit, we can then be led by the Father to knowledge of truth itself and to actually weighing these claims and seeing justice or beauty or compassion or goodness more truly. That's my time. I hope you enjoyed yourself for this rather long video. If you have any questions, reach out to me. Be happy to help. Thanks.